You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. Dozens of apartment buildings are for sale in the city, and their tenants are worried what might happen if the buyer ends up being someone who isn't interested in being a landlord.
The apartments in my complex were turned into tenants in common, then sold at a very high price to new owners. My life partner and I are currently being Ellis Acted by that owner who bought our building only to make money.
Advocates want a few things to change, including state law, but they're also hoping to pave the way for a different kind of buyer.
We also are calling on them to sell the building to community nonprofits so that the building can stay as rent-controlled housing, because we can do that. The city can do that.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. This was the scene on a residential block of 19th Street, just off of Dolores Park, a few weeks ago. Tenants of a 12-unit building here are facing eviction, and they and their supporters staged a demonstration in protest.
My name is Paul Moody. I've lived here in this building behind me for the last 18 years, and
I'm thanking you for coming, but also that feels really weird because you're here because I'm getting evicted, and my fellow tenants in this building, we're getting evicted. What do you think of that? Oh.
This eviction is happening under a state law called the Ellis Act. It's often described as a law that allows a landlord to go out of business, meaning it's not to get rid of a problem tenant who's done something wrong or is causing a nuisance, but to remove the units from the rental market entirely. It's what's known as a no-fault eviction, as in the tenant wasn't at fault and didn't violate the contract. Landlords using it have to pay a relocation fee for each tenant, as well as giving certain provisions for disabled people or the elderly. But because the landlord is deciding not to be a landlord anymore, when this law is used, everyone in the building gets evicted.
The Ellis Act is devastating neighborhoods like ours, communities like ours. And what do I mean by community? Well, I'm a gay man. I moved here like a lot of gay men years ago because I wanted a community of my own. San Francisco was that place, a place that I knew I could feel welcome and safe and have that sense of community. And here in this building, 6 out of the 10 units that are occupied have LGBTQ tenants. 5 out of the 10 have Asian Americans. And we have seniors in this building who have been here for decades, and we're all getting evicted. There's 20 of us that are at risk of losing our homes from this neighborhood that we've lived in for so long. And it's happening all over the city because of the Ellis Act.
What these tenants and their attorney and advocates say, though, is that the landlords of this property are actually owners of multiple properties, some of which they acquired in the last few years, and that they're using the Ellis Act in several of them. That's why the tenants suspect that these aren't people who wanted to be landlords at all, but rather that they're acquiring apartment buildings with the intention of getting rid of long-term tenants who are paying low rents, and then selling the building or turning it into condos for a profit. In other words, they think this is speculation.
Hello, my name is Larry, and I am a gay senior. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but I moved to San Francisco because I wanted to be over the rainbow. I have lived in this place. This place has been my home for over 31 years. I had trouble finding this place 31 years ago. And the only reason I have been able to stay here is because of rent control. But now I am facing eviction by an inhuman corporation. San Francisco currently loses about 400 rent control units a year. And I am afraid that I am going to end up being homeless like the 9,800 homeless people that already live here in San Francisco. I believe in laws that provide essential, affordable housing for all. Instead of the Ellis law, the Ellis Act that leads to people losing their housing. And so, today I ask you all to repeat after me. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
I'm Janine Reisbig, and my disabled life partner, Dale Golden, and I have lived in our rent-controlled apartment on Castro Street since June of 1980. Our apartment complex was sold to speculators, one of whom is part owner of this property here at 3661 19th Street. The apartments in my complex were turned into tenants in common, then sold at a very high price to new owners. My life partner and I are currently being Ellis Acted by that owner who bought our building only to make money.
I reached out to the people associated with the LLCs that own this building. One person told me he didn't have any comment and that I should talk to a lawyer, then hung up. The rest didn't respond. The tenants, meanwhile, are hoping that they can avoid displacement. They've done it before.
I'm not going to lie, it's been hard these last couple of years dealing with that, hanging over our heads, not knowing what's going to happen to us, because this is actually the second time they've tried to do this to us. They bought the building in 2018, and a couple of months later, we got the first Ellis notice, and they failed. We beat it. And we're going to beat this one too, so with your help. But a couple of us have already been served with the unlawful detainers. In fact, the process server is here today. You see the gentleman over there talking with Supervisor Mandelman with a box of papers. Those are the papers that he's going to serve us.
That's exactly what ended up happening. Once the speakers had finished with their remarks and people were starting to leave, the process server came up and handed over big stacks of papers for the eviction court proceedings. The tenants will be fighting their eviction, but bigger picture, advocates are taking aim at the Ellis Act. Here's Raphael Mandelman, the District 8 supervisor.
I have talked to and met with tenants facing eviction or threat of eviction in every neighborhood in this district, from Noe Valley to Glen Park to Buena Vista. It is a cancer on this city, speculation and the evictions that speculation brings. In one sense, this is hard, and in another sense, it's not. There are two things that need to happen to fix this problem. One, Sacramento needs to finally deal with the Ellis Act. And, I want to see the Ellis Act repealed. And I think everybody here wants to see the Ellis Act repealed. And we all know that real estate and real estate money has tremendous power and influence in Sacramento. We need the people who go to Sacramento to be maniacs about this. This has to be the thing that they care about, that when anyone else wants their vote, this is the thing. We have to stop the speculation in San Francisco because it is devastating our community.
Even if state legislators aren't able or willing to repeal the Ellis Act, he said they can do something in between. One proposal was made in the state assembly earlier this year, though it's since been put on hold, known as AB 854. It would require owners to hold on to a rental property for 5 years before moving to use the Ellis Act on their tenants. And if they did have other properties elsewhere where they've also tried to use the Ellis Act, they'd have to hold on to the property for 10 years. This is to discourage speculation and flipping. There is one other thing that tenants of this building would like to see happen. They'd like their building to be sold to a landlord who's dedicated to affordable housing.
We also are calling on them to sell the building to community nonprofit so that the building can stay as rent-controlled housing, because we can do that. The city can do that.
The city has established programs to do just that. Nonprofits buy buildings, and the homes become part of the city's affordable housing stock. In fact, there's a law in the city called the Community Right to Purchase Act that gives nonprofits a first bite at the apple when a multi-unit property goes on the market. If they're able to make an offer and buy the building, the tenants who are already there get to stay. When they do move on, the apartment is filled with a tenant from the city's affordable housing lottery. But of course, buildings in San Francisco are expensive. And I'm actually not sure how much money the city has to do this right now. I asked the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development for the approximate contents of the city's overall fund for acquiring housing, and I didn't receive an answer. But one thing we do know, whatever was in it before, a big chunk of money just got added to that fund. District 5 Supervisor Dean Preston recently succeeded in getting the Board of Supervisors to route $64 million from revenue that came in through 2020's Proposition I into an emergency fund to buy properties that are on the market. He told his colleagues before the vote that right now there are more than 100 buildings that look like they'd be prime targets for speculators. That's according to the members of the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board.
The Oversight Board's recommendations respond to prevailing trends in the real estate market, which show increasing numbers of rental properties going on the market at rising prices and with growing participation and interest by real estate speculators. They warned that we would be seeing a repeat of the market consolidation that happened after the Great Recession of 2008-2009, where institutional investors pounced on at-risk properties, and when players like Veritas Investments went from a big player to a local real estate behemoth. To be sure, preliminary analysis of market trends shows exactly what we feared, a repeat of trends we saw a decade ago. Of 117 buildings between 3 and 50 units on the private market, 99 of the sellers are individual or families with no connections to big real estate, in contrast to the folks who are lining up to buy these buildings. We're aware of 13 of those buildings already being sold, a quarter of which have been bought by Veritas Investments specifically. It's clear if we don't act now that we will bear witness to the displacement and evictions that for years have ravaged our city and cleared out our long-term residents. The time to act on this item is now.
Most of the supervisors agreed, but probably none more vociferously than District 9 Supervisor Hillary Ronan. She pointed out that housing preservation, this practice where the city tries to buy housing and keep people in place, is particularly important in a superheated market at a time when other safety nets have disappeared.
I only came in today as my father passed away last night, and I'm barely moving so that I could vote on this. And the reason that it is so important to me is because I grew up in a rent-controlled apartment in Los Angeles. My parents have been living there for 46 years, and I just got back from there. And if my parents didn't have that rent-controlled apartment, they would literally be homeless. That's how important it is, and that's the difference that it makes in people's lives. Luckily, in Los Angeles, where they live, this rent-controlled building is so old and so decrepit that no one would want to condoize it and kick them out and move into it, which, it's sad with people that don't have a lot of money that they want their conditions to be shitty just so that they have somewhere to live. This is the reality that people face that are so scared of gentrification. They're worried about positive changes in communities because they'd rather have a house than nothing at all in shitty conditions. And like it or not, because we live in an imperfect system that relies on market rate housing development in order to survive. We have no federal housing program to speak of that is new today, that is building more housing. We only have the very few programs that this city offers. Nobody in the federal government is building new housing these days. We don't have public housing anymore in this country. We have the small sites program, and we get to work with nonprofit developers to build 100% affordable. That's all we have for people like my parents, for people like my father. That's all that we have. And so every single building that gets Ellis Acted, every single year, hundreds, last year was a little less, but it's still in the over 70 buildings. All of those people might not have a home if they're kicked out of their rent-controlled apartments. That's how important rent control is. So we don't have time to just wait. We have $64 million that we can put towards this purpose. Why would we not do that?
They did, ultimately. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what this money could do and why it wasn't an easy or unanimous decision. You've been listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. Every year, news organizations participate in a program called News Match. During this time, which runs through the end of the year, your donation will be matched by a pool of funds created to support local journalism. Some of your neighbors have already joined in, and big thanks to those folks for sustaining local news. If you value in-depth reporting and storytelling like what we do here at the Public Press and with Civic, and you're in a position to support it, during Newsmatch is the time. You'll help keep our content paywall and ad-free, and your impact will be doubled. You can make your donation one time only, or for lasting impact, make it recurring at sfpublicpress.org. And there are plenty of other ways to help. Spread the word about Civic and the Public Press. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. Share a link to a story, or just talk with someone about a story that we've done. No matter how you choose to support us, thank you so much. Let's get back to the story about what San Francisco is trying to do to shield long-term tenants from speculation and eviction. I talked with Supervisor Dean Preston briefly about his proposal allocating $64 million of the revenue from a 2020 transfer tax measure, Prop I, to a housing acquisition fund. The idea is to set this money aside for the city or associated nonprofits to buy existing housing and keep it out of speculators' hands. There has always been, I think, speculation in the San Francisco real estate market, particularly when the market is hot, which, like, in recent memory has been pretty much always. Is this an increasing trend? Do you see any troubling signs that we're in a situation now that we weren't in, let's say, pre-pandemic?
Well, as you say, we've had, a hot market for a long time in San Francisco, and then that market has cooled off here and there. And that's when you really need to be on the lookout for the speculators coming in, right? And so we saw that in the foreclosure crisis a decade ago, where the prices stabilized or even dropped. And that's where there's even more profit opportunity for the big players to come in and buy. So we're seeing the same thing here, where obviously the economy's taken a major hit over the last couple of years, and there's been a lot of uncertainties in the rental and ownership market. And so there's more opportunities for investors to come in and buy now. Now, most of the sellers here are smaller owners, so-called mom and pops, folks who may own one building or a limited number of units. But the buyers, there's clearly a trend that we see big institutional investors coming in and buying.
I wanted to know what signs he sees that there is indeed a lot of speculation going on in the city right now, and how that threatens renters. How do we know, for example, that of the 117 or so buildings on the market, most of the sellers are small-time landlords, and a lot of the prospective buyers are big real estate companies, corporate investors, or other potential speculators?
Yeah, we're blessed with some amazing advocates who have been tracking it. I mean, all this information is public information. So the purchasers of real property, the sellers, the price is all public information that you can get from their various services that aggregate that information, or you can go directly to the city government website, the assessor recorder. There's a little bit of delay in getting that information up there. We have some members that were appointed to the Housing Stability Fund Oversight Board who've actually been really active in compiling this information and discussed it at their last meeting and mapped the data actually on where the buildings are being sold. But at the end of the day, building sales, the purchaser, the seller is public information. It can be a little hard sometimes because sometimes there are new limited liability.
Right, they're all doing this LLC thing. Nobody buys a building outright. They buy it under like 123 Main Street LLC.
That's right. And so that would suggest that the estimates usually actually underestimate the amount of corporate and consolidated ownership, because some of them, like Veritas, for example, it's pretty obvious that Veritas is buying a building. But then as we saw coming out of the foreclosure crisis a decade ago and now, that a lot of times you see these LLCs that are just created, new ones created for each building. And so it'll be called, 12345 Oak Street LLC. And then you have to try to dig in and figure out who that is. And there's some signs and there's some ways to track it. Who's the agent for service of process? Where is the corporation based? Right. And you can see sometimes the same address used. So there are ways to get at the information, but it's really a flaw, not just in San Francisco, but statewide, that we don't have more transparency around the corporate entities that buy property. For most of these big institutional investors, the business model is turning units over and getting long-term tenants, most of whom benefit from lower rents because of rent control, getting them out and replacing them with higher income, higher rent tenants. So there's different strategies to do that. Some of the larger institutional investors and landlords will be aggressive about making capital improvements or other, so-called improvements to the building that can generate and basically create the feeling of being a construction zone. A lot of advocates have referred to as renovictions, basically renovations being done as a way to push people out. So that's one way it happens. Another way it happens is particularly in smaller buildings. You see the investors utilizing the state's Ellis Act to evict everyone in the building and then convert the property to some form of ownership, either tenancies in common or condominiums. And so I think that anyone living in a building that is for sale is living in fear or waiting for that other shoe to drop. Now, for many of them, they can stay in their homes. They can fight the rent evictions. They can fight the efforts to displace them, but they need to know their rights and they need to resist the efforts to carrots and sticks that are often deployed by the new owners. So it's a very stressful period once those for sale signs go up, and a lot of tenants, particularly in smaller buildings, are at risk of displacement.
But as I mentioned before, the decision to allocate this money wasn't unanimous. That's because the program that's best known for these kinds of acquisitions, called the Small Sites Housing Acquisition Program, is overextended. And some of the supervisors were worried that allocating money to it signals a promise that won't be kept. Here's District 7 Supervisor Myrna Melgar.
So the ordinance appropriates the money to social housing, not specifically to the Small Sites Fund, but a lot of the messaging and in your speech for the sponsor of the legislation, my colleague Supervisor Preston, we talked about emergency acquisition of buildings. I watched the committee meeting where a lot of folks came to talk about the need for emergency acquisition, and I fully support that. I think where we disagree is putting the cart before the horse. So promising folks that we're going to save them from eviction because we're putting money into this program that is not currently viable, to me, is an empty promise. It is like putting gas in a car that has 2 flat tires and is in the shop getting fixed and promising people a ride. So most of the acquisitions for this program have been made actually by an organization in the Mission. And, the problems with the program is that it has put those organizations at financial risk. There are several buildings that are under forbearance, and we are not addressing that issue. The capacity of the organizations that have worked really hard to get to the point where they can acquire buildings has been really hard fought, especially by low-income communities that didn't have that capacity before. And I am not willing to keep continuing putting people at risk with restrictive requirements that we can't just wave away. As you all know, it is a process that we must go through in order to change any program requirements. We are just a few weeks out from negotiating next year's budget. I would rather work with the administration to make sure we do this quickly and easily to get folks on a good financial footing before we can start investing again.
And this is Supervisor Asha Safai in District 11.
This program is broken currently. There was one small sites acquisition done last year. It happened to be in my district. So I think my position is we are creating, at this juncture, at this day, false hope that we would be able to go out and do acquisitions.
One of the problems here is that property in San Francisco is really expensive, which kind of creates a circular paradox, as Supervisors Mandelman and Ronan pointed out.
We have very expensive properties with long-term tenants who their landlords or new owners can make a whole lot of money by getting those long-term rent-controlled tenants out of those buildings and then using those buildings to make a whole lot of money. And that is exactly why those buildings are so hard for the small sites program to accommodate, because the per unit value is so great.
There is something fundamentally problematic, which is high costs. The problem is, we all know that to live in San Francisco is so expensive. So to buy these buildings, it's very expensive. So then to sustain them, you have to have an income mix that's not easy to get. That is not something we can change. That is a reality that is going to be with us. So we could either decide to give up on the small sites program and say it doesn't work, or we can have a policy agreement, which from the conversation today, it looks like we're in unanimous agreement about this. We have to change the economics of the small sites program. Recognize that it's expensive, recognize that we live in an expensive city, recognize that not only do we want a diverse population, but we are dependent on a diverse population in order to have the workforce to keep our city a functioning place. This is not an option. This is a necessity. So if it's a necessity, and if housing costs this much, then why are we not having the discussion today, this is too expensive of a program, and we should just throw out the small sites program? Because that's what you're saying.
And there was another factor that several supervisors alluded to. Mayor London Breed has indicated she's not on board with this, and she is not, under city law, obligated to actually spend the money that the Board of Supervisors decides to allocate. Generally, the mayor and city departments do spend what's allocated, but there have been exceptions before. In 2020, all 11 supervisors set a mandate for the city to significantly expand its shelter-in-place hotel program to house homeless people during the pandemic. The mayor did not do this, and wasn't obligated to under city law. Several supervisors suggested something similar could happen here. Here's Supervisor Myrna Melgar again, followed by District 2 Supervisor Catherine Stephanie.
So instead of getting into a protracted war with the administration, I would actually rather collaboratively work to get them fixed, not just to acquire more sites, but to make sure that all of the agencies using this program are financially whole.
This budget allocation requires both the board and the mayor to agree, and this is where I get frustrated because we know that we cannot make the mayor expend these funds, and she cannot prevent us from appropriating these funds, and we're just going to end up in this stalemate, and critical funds that should be used for housing will go unspent. That is a problem for me. If we're not completely aligned, then we won't be setting ourselves up for success. It just won't happen.
In the end, though, the majority of the supervisors agreed this money should go to buying up housing.
There are 8 ayes and 3 noes, with Supervisors Melgar, Safai, and Stephanie in the dissent.
Thank you, and by a vote of 8-3, this ordinance is passed on first reading.
And for his part, Supervisor Dean Preston is focusing on what can be done with the money. He says these $64 million could pull hundreds of apartments off the market and protect their existing tenants.
It's by far the biggest allocation for allocations of these smaller buildings that the city has done. And just to put it in perspective, the small sites acquisition program, which has been in effect for about 7 years, has never been adequately resourced. And it's always been a little unclear how much is set aside for acquisitions, but in a given year, it's $1 million, $2 million, maybe $3 million. And we're looking at a $64 million allocation that will allow basically in the coming year, we could do as many acquisitions through this program as we've done since the inception of the program in 2014 combined. So, these units range in price in terms of getting the specific number. This will definitely be able to fund hundreds of units. It's very exciting that the board spoke so clearly in allocating these funds. I think the arguments around whether the mayor has the power not to spend have been a little overblown. I mean, we'll see. I cannot imagine that a mayor in the middle of an affordability crisis would refuse to spend funds on affordable housing. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. But I want to be clear. It's possible with every allocation. It's possible with our entire budget. Right? I mean, the city passes a $13 billion budget every year, and the mayor has the discretion to spend or not spend that money. So that's just how city government works. The Board of Supervisors appropriates the money, and then the mayor's office and the departments spend it. And so in theory, they can refuse to spend. There certainly have been times where they refuse to spend, but I don't start from assuming they're not going to spend this. I think that was a threat that was made by the mayor's office in an attempt to get supervisors to agree to oppose this. And I think it worked on a few of my colleagues, but it didn't work on 8, and 8's what we needed to make sure that we could override a veto. So these funds are going to be appropriated, they're going to be available, and I would hope that once that vote's behind us, that the mayor, especially when faced with tenants who are about to lose their homes and the possibility of acquiring those buildings and providing housing stability, is going to rise to the occasion and expend those funds as they're intended.
I reached out to the mayor's press office to see what her intentions actually are on this funding at this point and didn't get a response. She did issue a press release before the supervisors voted on this allocation, indicating that she intends to reform the small sites program and allocate some money to it from a different source, the general fund. And while we don't know how much the city has at its disposal in total to buy buildings, there are now millions more on the table for efforts to preserve housing and stave off speculation. I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP. New episodes every Thursday. Thanks for listening.